There's different names that we call people of Mexican descent in the United States. First is Latinos and Latinas. These are persons whose national origins or whose ancestors' national origins are in the countries of Latin America. Also included are people from the Caribbean and Central and South America. Hispanic is another term that we call people with Mexican descent. It is an English word derived from Hispania, which was a Roman name for Spain. As we can see here, they may not be the same terms, Latino, Latinas, and Hispanic. These terms together, though, are umbrella terms, which mask diversity and also may upset some people when they prefer the term of their national origin instead. The conquest period of the areas of what is now called Mexico occurred between 1500 and 1853, so more than 300 years of conquest. Beginning in the 1500s, Spaniards conquered indigenous populations in what is now Mexico and the southwestern U.S. for economic exploitation. Included in this type of oppression is rape. The offspring of sexual liaisons or mixed race children of the Europeans and Mexicans are called mestizos, and they outnumbered the colonizers. We have some myths and realities that we must talk about in terms of Texas. The Mexican government's actions, including freeing enslaved people and placing restrictions on U.S. immigration, angered U.S. immigrants. Myths praising heroism of white Texans still persist, and if you have visited Texas or lived there, you may know that Texans think of themselves as a separate country. The cause of the 1936 Texas revolt included the growing number of white immigrants coming illegally from what was the United States to Mexico, now called Texas. And with that, they brought the racist attitudes of these immigrants towards native-born Mexicans and the resentment of immigrant slaveholders towards Mexican anti-slavery laws. The Texas Rebellion occurred when U.S. colonizers went beyond the existing boundary and intentionally trying to incorporate new land. In 1845, the annexation of Texas occurred and led the U.S. to war, and finally it was settled through the Treaty of Guadalupe. In terms of conquering or annexing California and New Mexico, this was led by the discovery of gold in 1849, which led U.S. whites to enter California. At the time of acquisition, the 50,000 Mexicans in what is now New Mexico had long maintained cultural traditions, and so many Mexicans lost their lands to invading whites. In terms of Mexican-American immigration, there's various types of immigration. First is those who are here in the United States with official visas. Second are considered undocumented immigrants, and they're immigrants without legal immigration papers. And we have Mexican immigrants here here for work called Bracerios. They're seasonal farm workers on contract. And fourth, we have commuters. They're considered those with official visas that live in Mexico but work in the United States. And finally, border crossers. These are domestic workers with short-term permits. So Bracerios, again, these are people here working undocumented. In 1942, emergency farm labor Bracerio agreement was put into place, and it was between U.S. and Mexico to provide Mexican workers for U.S. agriculture. And still today, many Mexican American people of Mexican descent work in agriculture. Mexican worker entry periodically meets intense opposition, especially during times of economic recession. And that's where you get the arguments that Mexicans and Mexican Americans are taking all the good jobs. In reality, they're the jobs that most of us do not want. The U.S. economy later depends on immigrants from Latin America. They are the backbone for many of our corporations dealing with food, such as Dole, Green Giant, McDonald's, Burger King, Del Monte, Heinz, Hunt's, and others. So when you think about food, think about where your food comes from. More than likely, it comes from the work of the backs of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Again, we're going to talk about migration to the U.S. The U.S. involvement in Latin America long involved the U.S. government and major corporations. Many immigrants were pulled by U.S. jobs, so they would advertise, of course, higher wages than what they would receive in Mexico. They are also pushed into the U.S. by serious economic problems in their home countries. So again, to have a better life, they would, come to the United States, go through a lot of risk-taking, such as going across the border and having the Minutemen probably watch them and oppress them in various ways. We also have to think about maquiladoras. These are manufacturing operations in northern Mexico near the U.S. border, where they can take advantage of low-wage labor and weak environmental standards while advocating certain tariffs and duties. And so this is better for the U.S. economy, especially for business owners, because they can escape certain kinds of penalties, taxes, health code violations if they have their work placed in other countries. And so they have them placed near border towns, maquiladoras, where we have a lot, especially women, working there. And so with women working there, we also have women being violated, oppressed, and even killed. NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, accelerated U.S. investment in manufacturing in Mexico. Again, free trade. This is not the same as fair trade. Usually people working for U.S. corporations like this are working for very low wages and not the most hospitable working environments. The number entering illegally for permanent residence is less than media and anti-immigrant groups suggest. These immigrants or workers are coming to make a better life and send money back home. They don't want to be separate from their families, but they need to provide for their families. The 1986 Immigration Act and the 2006 Secure Fence Act and undocumented immigrants is what we're going to talk about next. We have legalization of undocumented immigrants in the U.S. since 1982. Sanctions for employers who hire undocumented aliens do not really occur. Reimbursement for government for cost of legalization is something that we needed to talk about, and reasons why legalization is not occurring as rapidly, especially for Mexican Americans or Mexicans. We have screening of welfare applicants for migration status and programs to bring in agricultural laborers that need to be taken into consideration when it comes to legalizing immigrants. Just like the other groups we talked about, we need to talk about stereotypes and how they're perpetuated and often cause us to react and interact with Mexicans, in this case, differently than others. So few whites saw Mexicans as white and compared them to Indian or black groups. Although they're not considered a race according to the U.S. Census, but rather an ethnic group, we treat them as a separate type of people. Their stereotypes are very similar to African Americans nonetheless. They're considered lazy and backwards, greasers and mongrels, which is really ironic considering that Mexican Americans are often also called hard workers when it's beneficial to us, but then lazy when it's not. Mexican Americans are faced with discrimination as immigration increases, and these types of immigration scares are known as the Brown Scare, menace to society, and a threat to the white race. There are particular gendered stereotypes. One about males is that they are crime-oriented or gangbangers, and this came out after World War II with the Zoot Suit riots, where Mexican-American youths wearing the Zoot Suits were attacked by military, particularly those coming from the war, and beat up because they wore a Zoot Suit. And after this, it was publicized in a newspaper that these Mexicans or Mexican Americans were going to retaliate and attack white people, and so it created a bigger riot. Another type of stereotype is machismo, where Mexican American males are seen as very chauvinistic or putting down women. Also, Mexicans or people of Mexican descent are seen as lawless and violent because of their Indian blood, and so there's this idea of a biological inferiority because of their mixed race. Negative stereotypes and prejudice are held at all class levels, including economic and political. Overly racist stereotypes that whites have changed for the better over time. However, stereotyping is still found in the media. Some of these stereotypes are that Mexican American families are too big to support, that they place less value on education, and are less work-oriented. Many Americans still think immigration is good for the country. However, again, this is not during times of economic downturns. Americans want the government to do more to control immigration and secure the borders, and punish employers who hire undocumented workers. Those who support say that undocumented workers should remain if they pay a fine and meet other requirements. They also say that legalization after working in the country for a certain amount of time should happen. The mass media perpetuates stereotypes for all groups, and for Mexican Americans, we see a decrease in stereotypical depictions in recent times. This is due to, again, activism by the Mexican American community, and of course the growing importance of Latina viewers. So if Latinas and Latinos see images that are stereotypical in the programs, they'll just simply boycott that program, and that station, that corporation would have to make some changes to get their viewership back. We have unbalanced representation in media. Often Mexican Americans are ignored or portrayed often as criminals in television. Only 2% of television characters are Mexican American, and 1.9% of them are speaking characters. They're often not represented as protagonists in video games. Often the antagonists are criminal, and they're included in racialized reports and newspapers. Historically, Mexicans and Mexican Americans are socially constructed by whites as distinctive inferior racial group, although again, by the census, they're an ethnic group. They can choose either black or white or other on the U.S. Census. Today, terms usually involve a view of Mexican Americans as being distinctive in racial and ethnic terms. Subordinate groups' reactions to experience of being socially constructed by dominant groups adds more layers to the social reality that they are considered a separate ethnic group or racialized group. Now we're going to discuss conflict and protest. Coercion was a fundamental factor in white domination in the Southwest. So again, being tricked or forced into giving up their own power. Over the next century, Latinos and Latinas suffered violence by whites. And more recent decades to the present, some whites continue to use violence against Mexicans and other Latinos and Latinas. Recent attacks by whites or undocumented immigrants crossing U.S.-Mexico border, as well as numerous websites with violent anti-immigration videos, Video games or racist commentaries on immigrants and Spanish speakers have grown. Again, Mexican Americans were activists for their own agency, for their own right to control their lives. Dozens of Mexican American protests occurred due to discrimination in southwestern cities during the 1960s and 1970s. Local governments sometimes used police forces to counter protests and control population, and many reported incidences of police brutality. Anti-immigration sentiment and anti-immigration ballot measures have stimulated organizations and actions, and in 2006, the International Workers' Day was a nonviolent protest to be active and against oppression for workers. So our first institution we'll talk about is economy. Mexicans were initially incorporated into the U.S. economy by often violent conquests of Mexican lands, and Mexicans were the first vaqueros, and this is Spanish word for cowboys. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, working conditions in agriculture were often severe and wages were very low. Few whites competed with Mexicans for these jobs. Women also worked during this time. Women were concentrated in agriculture, domestic service, and manufacturing jobs. Mexican Americans have long faced individual and institutional discrimination in the workplace. During the 1940s, some improvement was made, but discrimination kept most Mexican Americans in low-wage positions. During the 1960s, U.S. firms began building maquiladoras in northern border regions of Mexico, and many employers seek out undocumented workers because they will work for low wages and can be exploited more easily. Research has documented employment discrimination even today. And this chart shows you the types of jobs that Mexican Americans hold compared to European Americans. So in terms of managerial and professional specialty areas, only 15% of Mexican Americans hold that type of job versus almost 39% of European Americans. And most jobs that Mexican Americans have are service occupations, which tend to be low paying. And in terms of the most jobs, are the most popular jobs for white Americans are, again, the managerial and professional specialty areas. So we see here that they're not even in the same type of work. There is language discrimination still occurring, whether we should have a national language in the United States of English or just keep it open for the states to decide. So language discrimination in the workplace involves treating people unfairly because they speak a language other than English or use a dialect that is not in favor. And the Equal Employment Commission reports increase in complaints against language discrimination at work. Garcia versus Glore court ruling occurred in 1981, and the Supreme Court upheld firing an employee for speaking Spanish. So even the Supreme Court upheld a discriminatory practice in work. Thus far, a majority of federal court decisions dealing with workplace English-only requirements upheld the requirements. So English, although not by law as the official language, it is almost forced upon at work. Language discrimination periodically draws protests from Latinos and Latinas. Some more about the economy. Latino and Latina unemployment rates are relatively high for many decades. Mexican Americans' incomes are consistently low compared to whites. And the poorest families include workers who immigrated in recent decades with little education or economic capital. Again, if you come here with little resources, making it in the U.S. is not very easy. The U.S. has predominantly a service worker economy with decreasing industrial jobs. So again, we see more work in service work, particularly held by women. And industrial jobs, manufacturing jobs, are not held in the U.S. anymore. They're going overseas. So in terms of family income levels, we see here that Mexican Americans, compared to other Latino groups and Europeans, have the lowest family income at $41,000. And in terms of families below the poverty line, Puerto Ricans have a slightly more families below poverty line, but very close to Mexican Americans at 20%. And the children, those who are less than 18 years old, almost 30% of Mexican American children are living below the poverty line. So in terms of patterns, recent research shows two divergent patterns of economic mobility. Earnings of low-skilled foreign-born Mexicans decrease as immigrants reside in the United States longer. Earnings of high-skilled foreign-born Mexican increases as immigrants reside in the United States longer. So coming here with skills, with some kinds of resources, makes things easier in the United States. Movement of large numbers of immigrants into Latino and Latina communities buttressed local economies and maintain a demand for businesses providing Latina goods and services. So again, this is talking about economic enclaves and how important they are to provide jobs and also to keep the culture intact once in a different country such as the United States. Extended family and strong cultural frameworks remain at the core of many Mexican American communities. Mexican and Mexican Americans are neighbors of other Americans in the United States, yet other Americans treat them as outsiders. Growing numbers report housing and related discrimination by white neighbors. Housing discrimination plagues Latina families, both immigrants and established citizens. So even those who have been here for generations with documentation, they're just Americans or Mexican Americans, are still considered as foreign, as they're not really supposed to be here just because of things like their skin color or that they speak Spanish along with English. Patterns of discrimination have contributed to Latinas living in Hispanic majority neighborhoods. So it's not that they necessarily want to live in these neighborhoods, is that they've experienced discrimination and feel more comfortable living in neighborhoods with people like themselves. Some more about activism. Before 1910, only a few hand-picked Mexican Americans held office in territorial and state legislatures in the Southwest. Gerrymandering in some districts has diluted Mexican American voting strength and prevented election of Mexican American candidates. And what this is just moving lines in terms of where certain communities are to decrease certain kinds of votes. Voter registration and turnout of Mexican Americans has risen over the past 3 decades. The National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, or NALO, it is an empowerment organization for Latinos and Latinas. It played a major role in increasing Latino voter registration and turnout. Between the 1960s and mid-2000s, the number of Latinos and Latinas in state legislatures increased significantly. Latino percentage, less than 6% of the U.S. House members, are well below the Latino percentage of U.S. population of 13%. By late 2009, just 2 Latinos were in the U.S. Senate and 1 Latino governor held office. Mexican Americans are long underrepresented in the judicial system. The first judge was appointed in the 1960s. Altogether, Latinos make about 11% of all police, 3.5% of lawyers, 6% of various judicial workers. Arizona, California, and Colorado require jurors to speak English, screening out many citizens. And recent survey found only 35% felt they received fair outcome when they deal with the courts. So again, if you are not English speaking, you can't be on a jury. And let's say that you are being charged with some kind of crime. If you're a Spanish speaking person or that's your first language, it might be difficult for you to have a fair case because of the English only ordinances. Next, we'll talk about the Chicano political movement. It's a social movement that sought greater political power and less discrimination for Mexican Americans. And one particular group is La Raza Unida Party, and the goals included significant representation in local governments and pressing the latter to better serve Latino and Latina communities. Mexican American women held important roles in this group, and this feminism came easily because of the woman's traditional role and strength as center of the family. Unions and other organizing has a long history among Mexican Americans. The American GI Forum formed after Texas Cemetery refused to allow a burial of a Mexican American World War II veteran. Chicanismo is a philosophy of self-esteem and anti-racism, and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund addresses problems of jury discrimination, police brutality, and school segregation. The Mothers of East Los Angeles defends communities' quality of life against environmental racism. Now we'll talk about particularly unions for low-wage workers. First is the Confederation of Unions Obreras Mexicanas, and it was formed in 1927. And then we also have the Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee and National Farm Workers Association. This was created by Jesse Lopez, Dolores Huerta, and Cesar Chavez. We have the Agriculture Labor Relations Act, which was passed in 1975. It provided for protection of union activities. And we see that many Mexican Americans and other farm workers still get low wages and few benefits across the country. And so we see still today increasing number of members of mainstream unions. Growing Mexican American and other Latino and Latina populations in urban areas have led to political conflict and cooperation with African Americans. And modern capitalism sometimes pits new immigrants against established citizens who rely on lower wage, blue collar, and service jobs. General political competition between Latinos, Latinas, and African Americans also generates conflict, and white-controlled media focus more on conflict and neglect the cooperation between these groups. Mendez versus Westminster and was ordered in 1946. It said the federal judge ruled that segregation of children in Mexican schools in California violated the 14th Amendment. This was anticipated Supreme Court ruling from Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. For decades, some schools with high percentages of Latina students prohibited all manifestation of Mexican American subculture. Students were stereotyped. In fact, there was this term put on Mexican students that they were 6-hour retarded. Of course, that is derogatory. It's basically said that these students functioned well in the outside world, but were not good in school. They were mislabeled by schools, and they faced many forms of discrimination at school. Some more about language. During the 21st century, public schools still place too many Mexican American children in learning disabled classes. Textbooks still neglect Mexican American history, and de facto racial segregation still persists. Children with limited English proficiency became discouraged, developed low self-confidence, and failed to keep pace with English speakers. And these myths that these children are not good enough was propagated by nativists, and that bilingual education is ineffective. Just think about going to a country where your primary language is not your first language, but you want to learn it, but you're placed in a classroom where your language was not even offered as well. The bilingual education was not offered, and you just had to catch up. Of course, you're going to be seen as being low performing and not smart enough. In terms of educational achievement, Mexican American attainment is lower than that of mainland Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans. So among the Latin groups, they're seen as are ranked lower. The dropout or push-out rate is high but declining. Poverty and need to earn money to help relatives are obstacles. So again, very family-oriented, and education sometimes takes a second seat. Education is highly valued by students and their families. 9 out of 10 of these families believe that college education is important, and their goal is to have their children go to college. There are steps to improve public education. This includes Spanish language and Mexican American culture being included, involving parents more in classrooms, and increase meaningful interaction between teachers and students. So of 2008, and we look at educational attainment, we see that more than 45% of Mexican Americans have less than a high school diploma. This is higher than Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans by almost twice the amount. And those who have a bachelor's degree or more, only 9% of Mexican Americans do, compared to almost 31% of European Americans. Next institution we'll talk about is religion. Historically, Mexican Americans have been Roman Catholic. The formal doctrines of the church, however, no longer are major factors in their lives. Instead, we have this popular Catholicism. It's a blend of formal Catholicism and popular beliefs and rituals, and it played a more important role. The first Mexican American bishop of the Catholic Church was designated in San Antonio only in 1970. So although they have a long history with Catholicism, in terms of having power within that church, Mexican Americans didn't really get that position until the 1970s. Research demonstrates a decline in identification with the Catholic Church, however. We see more Mexican Americans now identifying as charismatic Catholics or Protestants or even evangelical Protestants. So now we're going to talk about theory with assimilation first. Assimilation theorists say that most Mexican Americans arrived in the U.S. voluntarily and generally improved their economic circumstances relative to those in Mexico. Aspects of traditional culture have begun to disappear as acculturation has proceeded. Again, acculturation is forced assimilation. However, a substantial degree of Mexican culture heritage still persists, especially with Mexico and U.S. being neighbors and continuing immigration. Bilingualism is an important issue, and we see here that most people of Mexican descent are bilingual. They speak both Spanish and English. We have some variations in assimilation. There's not enough English language training available, even for those who want to learn English. So we have some obstacles in the way. We have widespread use of English among immigrants, and this underscores the era of xenophobic calls for English-only laws and school policies. Structural assimilation, especially economic upward mobility, has come slowly for many. And behavioral receptional and attitudinal receptional assimilation have varied considerably within the Mexican American group and over time. And this last point talks about how receptive Americans are to Mexican American immigrants. Neither structural assimilation nor marital assimilation has reached a high level. So if we look at Morton's 7 types of assimilation, Mexican Americans have not reached many of them. 1970s study revealed some increased intergroup friendship contacts. So we see some more interaction, but we don't see it all the way up to marriage. Significant numbers demonstrate movement toward identificational assimilation. And this is diversity of self-identification labels indicates diversity of opinion. So we have some people who consider themselves Americans of Mexican descent and their identity is strongly American. Or we have Mexican Americans where it's a blend of both. Or Mexican in the United States where they're strongly Mexican. Maybe having a Chicano political stance, which is very, anti-racism, oppression. Racial and ethnic identification varies with class, age, experience, and whether self-defined or imposed. So again, class, coming here with resources or not, being upper class versus working class. Age, how old were you when you came to the United States and what kinds of influences have you had? Experiences, how much discrimination have you experienced? And is this label that you have self-defined or imposed? Just calling yourself a name is agency. If you can't call yourself a name of your own choosing, that's a form of oppression. So, talking about barriers again, structural socioeconomic incorporation also is limited. The ease of movement and incorporation to white institutions varies with perceived class and skin color. So again, if you're darker, moving up socioeconomically may be more challenging. And this is not just for Mexican Americans, this is for most communities of color. As long as there are major immigration streams from Mexico into Mexican American communities, traditional assimilation will be slowed. So maybe assimilation is not wanted. Maybe they want to keep their culture more authentic. And being that the borders are neighbors, that's more likely not to happen, complete assimilation. Latinos and Latinas are interested in developing or viewing their own mass media. And so we have some specific channels dedicated just to these communities in particular languages. And also, Latina viewing community is the fastest growing for television since of the 21st century. Now focusing on the power conflict perspective. The internal colonialism analysis says that Mexican American history began with ruthless conquest of northern Mexico. The problem in applying traditional colonialism perspective is that most entered as voluntary immigrants after initial conquest. So again, first contact with European Americans was that they shared a lot in common, that they both benefited from working with one another, but after time, they were also oppressed by the European Americans, especially those who desired land in Texas. Most of the significant difference between Mexican and European immigrant experience is that intensive discrimination and cultural subordination occurred later for Mexican immigrants in the U.S. So limits of this theory again is that Mexican immigration. Some limits for this theory is that Mexican immigrants entered an environment in which progress and mobility was generally limited due to low wages, inferior schools, and various types of discrimination. Internal colonialism analysis say that white employers have intentionally created a split labor market from which they have received enormous profits, essentially pitting groups against one another. Power conflict analysis emphasizes continuing reality that the majority of whites still see Mexicans as non-white and usually inferior. And some pressures Mexican Americans face still today is that they and other Latinas are pressured to see whiteness and things white as best. So they may hold certain prejudices against other communities of color that whites also hold. Many come with white racial frame already in their heads, exemplified by racially stereotyped views of African Americans held by some. Some native-born Mexican Americans feel that recent immigrants jeopardize the status of established Mexican Americans in the U.S., so they're seeing newer immigrants not like themselves and actually being problematic for their own success. We see now development of a new identity, a pan-Latino identity. An anti-Latina discrimination has led many Mexican Americans to adopt a broader Hispanic or Latina identity. The collective Latina Hispanic consciousness has developed since the 1600s. Mexican Americans have helped to generate the pan-Latino consciousness that ties them to other Latinos and contributes to a stronger sense of social solidarity.